Welcome to Make and Decorate with Stephanie, a podcast for makers who love to sew, quilt, knit, and decorate. Hello, everyone. I'm Stephanie, your host, and this is episode 100. 3 digits. Yay. Woohoo. I am so thrilled to have reached this major milestone. And many, many thanks to all of you for listening and supporting this podcast over the past 5 years. The topic for today is puff quilts. This type of quilt has come back into the limelight over the past couple of years. I didn't know much about them and was curious to find out more about these fun, puffy quilts. But first, let's chit-chat. We've made it through most of winter, which has been relatively mild here in the Chicago area. This weekend, we turned the clocks forward back to daylight savings time, which means an extra hour of daylight until November. Yay. It's so awesome. Last week, we had crazy weather patterns, and actually the entire country did. There were storms from the West Coast making its way across the country to the East Coast. We were supposed to get 8 to 10 inches of snow, and all we got was some rain, which was good, but it went right below us. So if it were like a little bit further north, then we definitely would have been hit, but we didn't. So right this week we're kind of experiencing some normal average temperatures for Chicago this time of year, which is in the 40s, mid 40s. But it's March, so anything can happen. We can, go back to winter, or we can spike up to summer for a day or two. It's just how it happens around here at this time of year. Last week, there was a 60-degree day. I worked from home, and Cooper and I had a break out on the deck midday. It was a little bit after 12 noon. It was so warm and nice out, and while sitting in the sun and enjoying a rare blue, clear winter sky, I heard bird noises. And I couldn't tell where they were coming from at first, and they almost sounded like turkey gobbles, a lot of them. And then I realized they're more like honks, honk, honk, honk. And I looked up, and it was a massive migration of geese. Triple V formations flying right above us, and more double and triple. And then there was this huge single V formation, the biggest one I have ever seen. And it was all this goose chatter flying across my head in the sky. And they kept coming from the south, and they were flying directly north. So it was really a sight to see. I've never seen it before. I've seen, I've seen like the occasional geese little V, flight in the air here and there across the year, but nothing like this. This was definitely a migration. And it was really cool. And I don't know, maybe I'm the only one other than bird watchers that gets this excited to see these beautiful V formations flying in the sky. And when I went back inside to get back to work, it just put me in a really good mood. It was really fun. It's like the promise of spring is right around the corner. The geese are coming back, so that means that it's coming. Spring is coming. In fact, it's just right around the corner in a couple of weeks, technically on the calendar. I really think the transitions of the seasons are so beautiful with the wildlife, nature, trees, and the weather shifts. And I know it's paradise to live in a year-round warm tropical place, but I really would miss the 4 seasons of the weather transitions. Maybe I wouldn't miss like the sub-zero temps, but I still do love, the super bright green new growth of spring. And my favorite time is the autumn, where then everything starts to go dormant and the leaves turn these beautiful, vibrant, jewel tone colors. Last month, I started planting seeds for this year's garden. So I started the seeds indoors. This is my second time planting seeds. Last year, I just tried it on a whim for the first time after watching some YouTube videos. And I had no idea what I was doing. I just got the heated mats to put under the trays, the LED plant lights, the seedling mix, and then I just planted everything at once in March, which was a little late. You can see I already did a lot of things wrong at that point, and I didn't even know it. Surprisingly enough, most of those seeds that I grew last year did germinate and they worked out in the garden. After planting the transplants of the seedlings is when I realized that I started a lot of them late and others started too soon. So I took care to sort of research that this year and realized that certain plants need to be started 10 to 12 weeks before the last frost date and others only 3 to 6 weeks. So I got a clipboard and I printed out a seed inventory list. This is probably overkill, I know, but it was kind of fun for me to do in early February. So seed inventory list charts and a seed starting schedule to keep me organized. And these were free downloads from a couple of websites, and the links will be in the show notes. I'll update more about what I planted in an upcoming episode in April. So let's move on to sewing. I have been sewing a couple of Patreon reward gifts for March. So there's 2 people that get those, and I am nearly done. They will probably ship out end of this week or so. So be looking for those in your mail. Happy mail. More chain piecing on the Irish chain quilt. Again, I do not like the pattern instructions for this quilt or the cutting instructions, but it's way too late, and it will turn out great. It's just the instructions are lacking, and I just have to get over that because I know now what has to be done to stitch out these blocks. So it's just getting through it, and a lot of it is chain stitching, which is good. If you've ever started a pattern where you didn't like the instructions or techniques, it really is challenging to work through and get it completed. At least for me, it is. The upside is that this is a rare occurrence for me. Most of the quilt patterns I have made have been great, and it's just hit or miss, I guess. But I'm thinking about the quilt patterns I have made in the past, and the ones that stand out to me are Tula Pink and Allison Glass. Oh, and Elizabeth Hartman. Very, very good quilt instructions, illustrations. Tula Pink is a graphic designer, so she has designed and printed her pattern instructions in a booklet. And for that butterfly quilt that I made, it was just so organized and easy to understand, which that is a pretty complex quilt to make. So it was interesting because it didn't seem as daunting as it first looked versus this Irish chain one is a lot more. It is a lot more challenging to get through it. And it's not a technically difficult quilt to make. All right, on to sewing clothes. When I can get more time, I want to make more clothing for me. I have narrowed the list down to these for a spring, summer wardrobe. Cashmerette, I have the Concord t-shirt pattern. I want to make that. I want to make the cedar dolman woven short sleeve shirt, which should be pretty simple. Dolman sleeves are, basically you just stitch all the way down the sleeve and down the shirt. I also have the Webster top and dress pattern with a kit that I purchased so many years ago. The kit has this really pretty purple silk fabric. I really need to pull that out and get that sewn. Helen's Closet, I have the York Pinafore pattern, and I have fabric for it. So I really want to make that one. Again, I don't think that's a very complicated one. There are no sleeves. And also the Made by Ray rose pants pattern. I really want to make those because they just look really, they're good. It's a good pattern for summer because I can see that if you made them with a linen cotton blend, it would just be so breezy, flowy, and elegant looking. Those are the items on my list to try to get made this spring and summer. So we'll see what happens. In knitting, oh boy, let's talk about this Cardizen cardigan. I did not complete this by the 28th, but the body of the cardigan is done. Only the sleeves are left. And if I really pushed myself, I could have completed it by the 28th. However, I stopped at the sleeves because I knitted way too much every night, and I ended up with, a flared up painful tendonitis again at my elbow. And when I couldn't even lift a cereal spoon without pain, so I just stopped. I was like, it's not that important to get this done, killing myself. I folded it up and I put it away out of sight. And I went to a physical therapy session for the tendonitis, and it was definitely overuse and overworked. So I've got some stretching exercises, and I just have to let it heal. So no more knitting for me for a few months. And also, speed knitting projects are a no go for me. I just can't do it, I guess. So I don't know. And I even do the Norwegian knitting technique, which really is easier on your joints than the other types of knitting, the throwing and whatever, when you do the purl stitch from the right yarn from the right hand over to the left. The other reason why this happened, this flare up in the tendonitis, is that the cardigan is made with only the garter stitch throughout the whole body. The sleeves have some stockinette, but it is the same stitch over and over and over again for over 200 rows. And that definitely is why I think it also flared up faster than, let's say, if I were doing color work, because I made a lot of those Christmas balls over November and December and never had a problem. But it wasn't exactly the same stitch all the time. And when I do color work, it's at a slower pace because you're switching yarns over. So that I think is also a factor of why it flared up. So just a note of caution for any of you out there that maybe knitting and not knowing why your tendonitis is flaring up. Look at the type of knitting that you're doing, and if it's just a single knit stitch for rows and rows and rows forever and ever and ever, that is why. If you guys are on the Last Homely House newsletter or email list, Kate has a new Aurifil box of thread. It is so exciting. I just love it. So I ordered one. It is a set of, I believe it's 10 spools of thread. They are 12 weight, which is perfect for hand quilting and embroidery, machine embroidery, or even hand embroidery. And the outside of the box has a photo of Kate's English paper pieced hexies, and it's titled Slow Stitching at the Last Homely House. It looks really pretty, and I love the curated colors that Kate picked out for this set. There are 3 blues and 2 greens, a magenta color, and then like an orchid pink color. It's like a purpley pink, a red, a yellow, and then a variegated one, which I guess is the Marrakesh. It's a color variegated thread that Kate has hand quilted with before, and I think is one of her favorites. And I've used it the Marrakesh as well, but not in the 12 weight. I've used it more in a quilting weight. This 12 weight collection is probably the best I have seen out there as far as the color selections. So well done, Kate, if you're listening. I plan on using this on my Heidi Parks vignette quilt along, which has hand quilting in it. So let's take a look at what I'm watching. Disney Plus, there is a new season of The Mandalorian. It's back on Wednesdays, and Baby Yoda, or Grogu as he's called, is as cute as ever. And that's really the only reason why I watch this. It's not really like my thing. But the character, that little Baby Yoda, is so darling and so funny and cute. So that's why I watch it. And of course, my husband loves the show, so we can watch it together. On Netflix, there is a show called The Full-Time Wife Escapist. It's a Japanese TV show. It's subtitled. Mikuri is a young woman. She has a master's degree, and yet she is unable to find a job. Her father gets her a part-time job as a house cleaner for a single guy that works a lot in the tech industry. Then her parents move out of the city. I'm not telling too much, I don't think. And Mikuri comes up with a crazy plan to do a common law marriage with Himasara, who is that guy. And then it ends up being like this employer-employee contract between them. So she earns a salary for the housekeeping. It's like a job. And as things progress, it gets interesting, and their contract keeps getting revised. And the main thing for Mikuri is to change the old ways about housewives that do not get compensated in any way for their housekeeping, cooking, etc. And they're looked down upon by working professionals, and she just thinks that that needs to change, of course, right? So it's a fun show. It's like one season, and then there's one, it says a second season, but it's basically like a New Year's special, and it's one episode. Very cute show. There's a lot of comedy and interesting things in that. So it's called The Full-Time Wife Escapist on Netflix. There's another show on Netflix I just wrapped up. It's a current show that they release 2 episodes every week, one on a Saturday and one on a Sunday, and it just finished up the 16th and final episode. This one is called Crash Course in Romance, and this show is so good. It is one of my favorites, and I couldn't wait for these episodes to come out every week. Uh, it's about this super celebrity teacher, a star teacher in Korea, and he makes a lot of money doing this because this is a very prestigious and sought after by many parents and students, so that they can make the highest grades in math and in all of their studies, actually. But he happens to be a star math teacher, and there's a lot of characters in the show, and every single character has their story, and none of them are very superficial at all. I mean, they really have a specific role that binds them all together. And it's just very comical. There's a group of moms that have their own online group, and the Skynet mom group, and they're just of course there are some of them that are just way too pushy and hard on their kids to do well in the math and all the testing and so forth. And then, of course, there's a lot of comedy. There's some drama, but then there's this underlying story of a serial killer. It's not a very big part of every episode. It's just kind of like in the shadows, and it comes up every now and then. And the way that it's woven into the story, uh, it's very interesting when it gets towards the last two episodes. I highly recommend this show. I just absolutely love the story. So, Crash Course in Romance. I'm kind of sad that it's over. Okay, we are done with Chit Chat. I just want to mention my Patreon page, patreon.com/make and decorate. I post a bonus podcast episode once a month exclusively for my patrons. There are some behind the scenes videos that I have posted as well. And I just want to say thank you to my patrons for your continued support. I would not be able to continue the show without you. So thank you very, very much. The main segment is puff quilts, a look at historic and contemporary puff quilts. I'm going to tell you a contemporary story of a puff quilt. The Met Gala. If you are not familiar with this event, it is an annual fundraiser event held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art to benefit the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Costume Institute of New York. Every year, there is a theme that the guests are expected to dress for, which is usually haute couture, which is luxury handmade fashion. I mean, these outfits don't start below $10,000, and I'm certain that they go all the way up the scale to actually just, obscene amounts of money for these outfits. The 2021 Met Gala theme was In America, a Lexicon of Fashion. At the 2021 Met Gala, rapper A$AP Rocky wore a puff quilt cape wrapped around him like a cocoon, and it draped onto the floor with a train. This was one of the most talked about looks of the event, and it appeared in Vogue magazine, New York Times, and countless other magazines and fashion blogs. I was interested in the story behind this puff quilt worn by Rocky, and a new and upcoming fashion designer, Eli Russell Lynette, had this puff quilt cape in his 2022, or a version of it, in his 2022 spring fashion show. And Rocky contacted Eli, and he wanted to wear the puff quilt at the Met Gala. So then began the design and the fabrication for this layer of his ensemble. He wore a suit, I think it was silk or whatever, also designed by Eli Lynette. And Rocky said that he wanted layers and chaos. The quilt is inspired by an antique puff quilt that Eli found at a California thrift shop. As he designed the quilt, he told Vogue magazine, "I quilted on things that were important for me, from my dad's robes to my boxers. Then we used these amazing plaids and flannels and embroidered my family's name all over the quilt." Eli then commissioned quilter Zach Foster, who specializes in burial and memory quilts, to take the repurposed fabrics and fabricate the puff quilt cape, which that puff quilt is a simple square block puff quilt done in a bright color palette of yellow, green, red, blue, and brown mini floral prints like the 1930s reproduction prints. At the top of the steps at the Metropolitan Museum, the red carpet, Rocky opened his arms wide and revealed the backing of the quilt, which was pieced plaids and those flannels, those repurposed fabrics in various red colors. Then there was a low volume black and white flange in place of the binding. It was really a stunning look on the red carpet. And also inside the quilt cape, there were handles that he was holding on to. So that is what sort of kept this quilt on him, and he was easily able to wrap it around himself, walking the red carpet. But it was really stunning and not surprising that quilting is considered a lexicon American fashion. It just really made me happy to see this quilt on the red carpet at such a prestigious event. I will end this story with a quote from Vogue magazine. Rocky credits Lynette's work for keeping him cozy and evoking the sense of playfulness that is an essential element of American style. Now let's back up to the history of the puff quilt. First, the puff quilt did not start off as the puff quilt we know of today. It was called the biscuit pattern and was one of the most popular quilts of the American Victorian era circa 1876 to 1914. These biscuit quilts were commonly made of silk and satin and velvet on the top, filled with cotton, and sewn to cotton fabric to make the biscuit sandwich. These quilts were considered a sign of social position and affluence. They were mostly made for wall decoration or a sofa pillow and were considered very elegant at that time. Think of Downton Abbey. So there was a lot of velvet in that show during that time. That is also during that Victorian time of the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And in America, this is one of the things that were also up there in the upper echelon. And due to the decorative use, many of these have survived in good condition, and many museums have biscuit quilts in their archives. Another thing to note about the biscuit quilts is that they were not cozy or comfortable. The heavy velvet and wool fabrics and the cotton batting, and they also used wool batting to stuff the puff or biscuit quilts. They did become hard and lumpy over time. There were larger biscuit quilts made as bed coverings, and I'm going to share with you 4 of the biscuit quilts that I found that are currently in museums. They may not be on exhibit, but they are part of the curated museum collections. The first one is made of satin, and it's a baby quilt circa 1930. And this is at the museum at Texas Tech University. It is a baby quilt, and the satin is a very pastel. There's pinks and very light, like a mint green color in there, and a couple of various shades of the very light pink. It's done in the square puff, and then there's a big rectangle in the center of the quilt, and that isn't puffed, but it is stuffed with batting and quilted. There's a bow quilted in the center. It's a very pretty quilt, and it is circa 1930. The International Quilt Museum has 3 what they call puffed squares. And all of these, the maker is identified. This is why I always say to label your quilts. Label, label, label them so people know in the future who made your quilt. The geographical origin, they say, on this first puffed quilt is Talbot, Maryland. And this is hand pieced. It is circa, the date range is probably when it was made between 1880 and 1900. It's a pretty big quilt. It's 86 by 70 inches, and the fiber filling is wool. And it has like a really big red border around the puffed squares part of the quilt. I'll have pictures of these in the show notes so that you can see them, and a link to the International Quilt Museum. There's another puffed squares, or what they call they alternate patterns, called Biscuit Quilt. This one is also date ranged in 1880 to 1900. It is 59 by 35 1/4 inches, not as big as the other one. And it is machine pieced, made in the United States, and the primary fiber is silk. So it looks like this one was the filling was silk, and the primary fabrics are a mix of taffeta, surah, satin, and figure weaves. And then there was a straight applied binding. It's good information that the International Quilt Museum gives on these quilts. Then the other puffed squares quilt that they have is possibly made in Pennsylvania. It is machine pieced. It's 74.5 by 65 inches, and the date range is around 1910. The fiber that it's stuffed with is wool, and the fabric is suiting serge gabardine wool. And then there is a quilt, a biscuit quilt. It's actually a pretty, I don't know what you call a valuable one, I guess, because of its associations to a president of the United States back in the Civil War era. James Polk was the president for one term, and his wife, Sarah Childress Polk, has a puff quilt, and it is definitely an antique, and it's a Tennessee pieced quilt in a honeycomb or mosaic pattern, comprised of cotton and velvet pieces with a wide black satin border and backing. A signed letter accompanies the quilt that says this was a lap quilt, and it once belonged to First Lady Sarah Childress Polk. And then it descended through the family. So I don't know. I got this from the Civil War Quilts website. I think it is part of someone's private collection now, because I believe it was purchased. But there is a good photograph of that. Oh, and I do have one more. This quilt belongs to the Smithsonian collection, and it is not currently on exhibit. It is between 1890 and 1900 when it was made, and it's Mary Watson's Biscuit Parlor Throw. And the entire quilt is all of the puffed square blocks. There's no binding. And it was made in the United States. It was machine pieced, and other techniques used are embroidery. It's 59 inches by 35 1/4 inches. And the primary fiber is silk. And the fabric, so it was stuffed with silk. And then the fabric is a mix of taffeta, surah, satin, and figure weaves. Did I already talk about this one? I don't think so. It's actually, it must be a similar quilt, because the first one that mentioned the surah, which I need to look up, I do not know what that is. Here it is. Oh wow, it is the same quilt. Oh my goodness. Yet one is I wonder if the International Quilt Museum loaned this from the Smithsonian. This is too funny. So I just discovered it's the exact same quilt. It seemed too familiar when I read the primary fabrics. So yeah, this is indeed the same quilt. So I mean, it would make sense that the Smithsonian owns it, and it probably does go out loaned on exhibit, just like that one big quilt exhibition at the Boston Fine Arts Museum. They also had Smithsonian loaned quilts for their exhibit. So yeah, they're There are some, they're not as popular as the crazy quilts were in that time. So it was a bit harder for me to find even these to talk about, but they are out there, and a bunch more museums probably do have them. It just wasn't published, um, I guess, on their websites or for whatever reason. But so these are the antiques and origins of the puff quilt back in the day, and when they were mostly made by hand and stuffed with cotton, wool, or silk fibers, and made from um, repurposed clothing and those heavy fabrics like velvet, and also satin and silk. Moving forward in time, the biscuit or puff quilts made a big comeback in the 70s. And the stuffing of these quilts were commonly used pantyhose. They were cleaned, but used, probably had runs in them, and they repurposed them as the filling of these quilts, which also made them lumpy and not very comfortable. But these quilts in the mid 70s and onward were also filled with polyfill batting, which is very light and fluffy and made for much more soft and comfortable warm quilts, which could be very functional as bed coverings. Thus, the puff quilt term replaced biscuit quilt. Some will say they are all the same: biscuit, puff, bubble, quilt. And I believe biscuit quilts are the ones made prior to the polyester filled puff quilts. And puff and bubble seem to be interchangeable terms based on my research. They do seem to be used interchangeably. I know Shabby Fabrics has a video posted, and they refer to their quilt pattern as a bubble quilt, and other channels have published them as a puff quilt. And I think puff quilt is more, commonly heard than bubble quilts, but I think they're the same thing. The construction of puff quilts from the 70s are very different to how they are made today. So how would you make a puff quilt? Until recent decades, puff quilts were made as individual completed puff blocks. The templates were traced and glued to cardboard or very fine sandpaper. They were machine sewn right sides together all around, leaving a small opening, just like if you were making a pillow. The corners were clipped and it was turned right side out, stuffed, and then the opening was sewn closed. So it's basically making a bunch of little pillows. The puff blocks were then sewn together, starting with 2, and then they kept adding on per the pattern. And today, the puff quilts are made a bit differently in that the blocks are not made one by one completely. Also, today, it is common to make the top of the puff block 1 inch larger than the bottom block piece. Back in the 70s, and I have a puff quilt pattern booklet from 1976 called Stuff and Puff, and I've looked through all the patterns in here, and both the top and the bottom pieces are cut to the same size. It may have been just this publication that cut the top and bottom the same sizes, because I have seen the antique biscuit quilts at the museums refer to them as having the top piece 1 inch larger than the bottom piece, which is how you would make a puff quilt today. And the top piece is cut 1 inch larger than the bottom piece so that you can make the little pleats on all 4 sides, and it accommodates the 3D-ness of the puffy filling. Another upgrade in making puff quilts is that the blocks are sewn without the polyfill first, and then they're sewn in columns, which is at the time that the filling is added. So a column of puff blocks are first sewn together on 3 sides of the block, leaving the 4th side open. And then when it's ready to sew to the next column, that's when you fill each puff block of that first column, and then you will stitch that to the second column. And then it's the same process thereafter for however long or large your puff quilt is. There's really a lot of different ways now to make a puff quilt, and it looks really fun and quick to make. Some people add binding like normal. Yarn tie quilting is done a lot on these quilts because uh, the quilt is already really, it's like a quilt as you go quilt, and it's stuffed, and the puffing the filling is stitched into that. Let's say if it's a square shape, so it's already quilted, and adding the yarn ties really just make it more decorative. I haven't made a puff quilt yet, but it's definitely on my list of must make. Um, I have to make this quilt now. And it really does look fairly easy. You don't even have to make a big bed size quilt. I saw someone on YouTube make a bed, like a little cat bed size quilt, and it was really only like, nine quilt blocks. The most popular style of puff quilts are the square blocks of the puff quilts, but there are many other different types of shapes and patterns that you can make a puff quilt out of. Even in this 1970s quilt booklet, a lot of the quilts are made, like there's one made out of hexagon shapes, there's diamond shapes, and all different kind of shapes. And then there are decorative appliques that are stitched on top of them. So there is just a lot of different ways that you can make a puff quilt. What about the cleaning of puff quilts? Because they are so puffy. They are so like three-dimensional. And one thing about the original biscuit quilts is that they were not washable because of the types of fabrics that were used to make them, and what they were stuffed with. Of course, today, though, they are washable. You can use, if you use polyfill and cotton fabrics, the puff quilts can be laundered and tumbled dry. However, use your own discretion to clean your puff quilt as you prefer. You can machine wash and air dry it, air hang it to dry. I would not dry clean a cotton puff quilt, although it can be done. So just know that it can be washed and dried just like a regular quilt if it is out of cotton and polyfill. There are a couple of other types of puff quilts that you can make and are being made. One of them is knitted and stuffed hexes or squares joined into a quilt or blanket. It looks really, really cute, and I love the texture of the knitting. There is a link I will post by Tiny Owl Knits, and it is the Beekeeper's Quilt Pattern. There's another blog post link that I will put in the show notes from Make and Do Crew, and the link that I will put in there is they do a post on the secret to assembling the beekeeper's quilt. Then you can also crochet a bubble quilt. I have a link to a YouTube video that shows an easy crochet pattern. And again, the texture is really nice. And depending upon what yarn you use, that could be the softest, fluffiest quilt ever. So there is no end to puff quilts. And the fact that they are so dimensionally puffy and thick and cuddly, is no wonder that they came back and are completely just seeing another revival of the puff quilt in the 2020s. And that will conclude this episode. I think we should do a puff quilt along in the near future. Like, I don't know, late spring, early summer. If you're interested, and it doesn't have to be a big one. I think we could just do, like, if you have a dog or cat, we can make little puff quilts for them to lay on, or a baby quilt. You could DM me on Instagram or email me at info@makeanddecorate.com if you're interested in doing a small puff quilt along. On the next episode, my guest is Jennifer Moore from Mona Luna, an organic cotton fabric designer with exciting news. So you will not want to miss that. I'll be back to chat in a couple of weeks. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to the Make and Decorate with Stephanie podcast. Visit my podcast page at makeanddecorate.com for links to what was talked about on this episode, and to leave me a voicemail, click on the Send Voicemail tab to record your question or comments. To further support this podcast, please join my Patreon group at patreon.com/makeanddecorate. All patrons receive a bonus podcast episode every month, and your subscription supports the cost to produce this podcast, from hosting services, recording and editing software, equipment, and more. Until next time, happy making and decorating!